Welcome everyone to our first general meeting of this year. Aren't we glad it's on Zoom instead of in person? I hope you've all been able to stay warm and cozy today, because certainly it's a day for that. If you don't already know, my name is Sid Dyke, and I'm co-president of our club along with Jane Withers. Special welcome to our new members who are experiencing their first CFUW meeting on Zoom. We also have some guests with us tonight, and I'd like to ask Maddie Hoodstratton of our membership committee to introduce them. Maddie, unmute yourself.
Okay, Kathy Stidwell, Heather De Silva, Julia Walden, and if Pat Campbell has joined us, that would be great as well.
I don't think she's here, but okay. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, ladies, and maybe after tonight you might like to join our club. We'd love to have you. As your executive can attest, I usually start off every executive meeting with some inspirational quotes. And when I was thinking about tonight's meeting, my thoughts went to New Year's resolutions. And I thought I would share this short PowerPoint presentation, which I hope will inspire you or make you go, So I'm going to share this, and hopefully this is going to work here. Where am I? Okay, some things to ponder. My New Year's 2026 resolution is to stop feeling guilty about not keeping last year's resolution.
That's a good one.
I don't call them New Year's resolutions. I prefer the term casual promises to myself that I'm under no legal obligation to fulfill. This year, my resolution is to avoid meeting people who ask me about my resolutions. I think I made too many New Year's resolutions this year. It took me almost a full day to break them all. My New Year's resolution is to be more optimistic by keeping my cup half full with ice cream. And finally, New Year's resolution number 1, be more awesome than last year. There we go. I hope you're inspired. Anyway, I'd like to ask Jane Withers to give the land acknowledgement. Jane? Jane, unmute yourself.
We acknowledge that the land where we live and meet is on the traditional territories of many First Nations. As treaty people and CFUW members, may we actively work for truth, justice, peace, and reconciliation, including supporting young Indigenous women through our scholarships. And I would like to, at this point, read you a poem. Maybe it will inspire you like the resolutions did. This poem is called Winter by Walter de la Mare. He was an English poet, so when he describes the English countryside in winter, it's slightly different from ours, but I think it would apply to winter at Crawford Lake as well. So this is the poem, Winter. And the robin flew into the air, the white mist through, and small and rare the night frost fell into the calm and misty dell. And the dusk gathered low, and the silver moon and stars on the frozen snow drew taper bars, kindled winking fires in the hooded briars. And the sprawling great bear growled deep in the sky, and Orion's hair streamed sparkling by. But the north star sighed low, snow, snow, more snow.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so the next person up is Diane Turner for the minutes. don't forget to unmute yourself, Diane.
Okay, finally got it. Yes, thank you. I wrote the minutes of November the 20th, 2025. I vetted them through the executive committee and I move their adoption.
Is there a seconder? Sue Gibson, all in favor? Carried. Okay, on to my report as co-president. At the request of National, I compiled a list of our charitable contributions that we made in 2025. This report will also be put into the newsletter, and I thought I would put it up on a screen so you can really have a look at where your money went to this past year. So I hope you can see that. As you can see, in 2025, CFUW Leaside East York contributed the following. Community and international outreach programs, we gave $3,070 to Sistering, $4,170 to the YWCA Women's Shelter, and $4,115 to Right to Learn Afghanistan. Total donations were $11,355. Scholarships, we gave 3 high school scholarships at $1,500. Total $4,500, 1 Indigenous scholarship at $1,500, and 1 transitional year scholarship at U of T celebrating our 70th anniversary, another $1,500, and our total scholarships were $7,500. So I really want to thank all of you for your generosity. I think for a small club, we can be very proud of what we have given back to our community, and kudos to you. So there you go. And finally, as Sue has mentioned, International Women's Day is coming up.
International Women's Day is going to be on, where are we? March the 10th from 12 to 2. This is an annual event, and it's recognizing Toronto clubs get together, and we have a guest speaker, and it's a lovely way of getting a number of members from clubs across Toronto together and to celebrate women and our accomplishments, both in Toronto and in Ontario, across Canada, across the world. So it's a really very important, and it's a lovely event. So it is going to be at the Faculty Club, and the guest speaker is Dr. Lorna Marsden. And Lorna, does anybody know Dr. Lorna Marsden?
Yes.
Okay, well, I do not know Dr. Marsden, but her resume is quite full of a lot of very significant accomplishments. She is a former member of the Senate. She's the president and vice chancellor of both Wilfrid Laurier and York University. So she is coming to be our guest speaker. The meals are salmon or mushroom. The vegetarian offering is a mushroom croquette, and the cost is $75. And if you could please do an e-transfer, this information about the e-transfer will be in the newsletter. So basically, it is an e-transfer. It's Douglas, capital D, S, capital S, Gibson, capital G, and it's docent Doug 70@gmail.com. Don't worry about it. If you haven't memorized this information, it's okay. It will be in the newsletter. But I really hope that you all will come out and support this, because it's really for anybody who has been there. How many people have been there in the past? So I think anybody who has been there in the past will agree it's a lovely event.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, and I can attest it is a lovely event. Yes, Diane.
I wondered, Sue, did you want to mention that when people are filling out their e-transfer, that they should indicate which menu item they would like?
Sure. As
Okay.
Diane said, please indicate which menu item you'd like. Otherwise, I'll be calling you the night before the event saying, oh my God, I hope you ordered salmon. I'm out of luck if you didn't. So, yes, please put your order on. Thank you very much, Diane.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Sue. Okay, Jane Withers, co-president report.
Yes, our club will not be organizing a coldest night of the year walk for sistering this year for 3 reasons. There's no one to organize it. And for the last 2 years, the weather's been too bad to walk. Also, we feel that we're asking for donations too frequently from our members. But anyone wishing to support sistering may donate directly to them through their website. And none of the money will go to the organization that organizes the walk, straight to sistering. The outdoor group will not be outdoors in January. They're all invited to join the movie group led by Sue Gibson on Tuesday, January the 27th at the Varsity Theater on Bloor Street. And Sue and I will be sending out more information closer to that date. I did receive a message from the national CFUW that CFUW and CARP, which is the Canadian Association for Retired Person, possibly not a flattering acronym, but we are now partnered on policy matters, on policy initiatives. And I received this quote, the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, CARP, has struck up a new partnership with CFUW, formerly the Canadian Federation of University Women, in an initiative to expand our collective voice with awareness, education, and advocacy for age-friendly public policy. And they offered a free 1-year membership in CARP. So I signed up. So far, I've got information on trips, and the other day I got information on how to stay young. So I'll put a bit more information about that in the February newsletter. And speaking of the newsletter, the February newsletter is being put together right now. So please send me any reports you have or photos or information that you would like to see in it by the 25th of the month, if that's possible. And that is my report.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, past president Sheila Lacroix. Sheila?
Yeah, here I am. I'm Sheila Lacroix. I wear 2 hats. One is issues and actions, and the other is past president. So I'm just very briefly giving you an issues and actions report. We had scheduled a meeting with our local MP, Rob Oliphant, today, but obviously due to the weather, it was postponed. So we're looking forward to meeting with Rob. Parliament does resume a week Monday, so I imagine if we meet, it'll be next week sometime. Our first issues and actions meeting of the new year is coming up on Tuesday via Zoom, and I'm hoping to review our various actions and look at options for streamlining because our committee numbers are down, and we want to remain vibrant. So if anyone's interested in joining us, let me know and I can send you the Zoom link. Now, on to my past president's report. It's quite lengthy because of my nominating committee chair role. Maybe I should follow up with what Jane Withers said. Maybe belonging to our executive is a way to stay young because it keeps our brain going. And other parts of our bodies, I think. Anyway, as past president, it is my role to strike a nominating committee to fill executive positions opening for the 2026-27 fiscal year. Marilyn Beach has joined this committee, and it would be great to have one more member. It's very important that you all know we have a strong executive to keep the club running seamlessly. Currently, we have a great team, and some will be continuing on to fulfill a 2-year time requirement. Others continue as they are just enjoying their roles and working with the team. Being involved has a lot of perks, and it is a good way to meet more members, learn more about our club and CFUW in general. And it's also a way to contribute by providing fresh ideas to us. So remember, this is your club. So what do we require? Being an aging group, we could use more help from those having facility with technology required for many roles. We are also understanding and flexible concerning individual needs like travels. Some of us might be snowbirds. Well, not to Florida, but maybe some other warm climate, family commitments, and of course, health issues that undoubtedly come up. So just to mention some roles, we're looking for a co-president incoming. This leadership position covers a 2-year period followed by 1 year as past president. This may sound intimidating, but there are a variety of strengths within our executive that provide balance and support. The main role is shared with the other co-president already with at least 1 year experience. And, some of us have more than 1 year experience at this. Secretaries. These positions only require a commitment of 1 year. The work is shared, so no one secretary is responsible for recording all of the meetings. Members who speak provide reports to the secretaries, and meetings held by Zoom have AI summaries provided and are recorded, so you can watch the recording if you feel you need to complete the minutes. Now, in terms of our social role, we're discussing no longer having a specific social convener. Instead, the plan is to handle social responsibilities, such as refreshments at our in-person meetings, by a committee of 3. This will be more flexible and with members' personal schedules. Finally, I'll mention newsletter editor. Jane Withers has been our editor for many years and would like to step down. It is an opportunity for our club to review our newsletter platform, frequency, and so on. We appreciate any insight or any input, and currently our newsletter is prepared in Word. The executive will be discussing the newsletter at our next meeting because there are other options other than Word. Some other volunteer positions have been the responsibility of one person for several years. Scholarship Trust, Barb Oakley is responsible for that. And she is willing to continue, but I think she'd be pleased to move on as well. I've been doing the website for years, and I enjoy doing it, but help or somebody to even replace me would be welcome. And social media, Janice Mitchell does our Facebook and Instagram. So it is time to review these volunteer positions, which may not have to be filled before the end of the next fiscal, but we would like to do some succession planning. We are working on updating the job descriptions so those interested will have a better idea of the tasks and responsibilities. So in summary, feel free to ask any questions. I'm always available, and do consider just helping, even in some small way, like maybe just for one event or whatever. And I hate to use that old term, many hands make less work, but it definitely, I think, is one of those statements, those wise statements. So thank you. And as I said, feel free to be in touch. Any questions?
Thanks, Sheila. Hopefully that it won't be too onerous a position for you to fill. Okay, next up is Marilyn Beach as treasurer.
Thanks, Sid. I'm Marilyn Beach and I'm the treasurer. As of December 31st, 2025, our bank balance is $11,179.47, with the GIC of $12,133.84. Our total assets are $23,313.31. Based on our present numbers, the liabilities for national, Ontario Council dues, Ontario Insurance, and the Scholarship Trust equal $4,119.50. And this gives us net assets of $18,193.81. I have a further report, but you can read all about it in the February newsletter.
Okay. Thanks, Marilyn. Okay, so I think we're now up to Carol, if she'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Wonderful. So I'm going to tell you about our next meetings on February the 19th, which is by Zoom. There's been a swap in dates with our speakers in February and March. Bella Lamb, who's CEO of the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada, she'll be speaking on inspiring hope through action. And Bella and the Institute strive for a world where animals, people, and the environment thrive together. And she brings us Jane Goodall's message of hope through action, inspiring all of us to embrace our individual power to make a difference. On March the 19th, which is in person, Diane Goodwillie will speak in person on the Pacific Islands beneath Paradise, and she comes recommended from the Etobicoke CFUW. After Soren finishes his presentation, attendees are requested to ask only one question during the Q&A with our speakers to ensure as many people as possible have the opportunity. And if there's more, they may ask more questions. So if you have witnessed or you strongly recommend a speaker for their topic or presentation style, please, this is for next year, starting September till next May. Contact either myself or Susan Wright, program co-conveners. And actually, Susan is ill tonight, and she was the one that did research. She was looking for something on climate change, and she came upon Crawford Lake. She thought, this is really interesting. And then she found out about Soren Brothers. So I'm moving on to introduce our speaker. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Soren Brothers, the first ever curator of climate change at the ROM, the world's first major global museum to create such a position. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. He is also leading a project of the Global Lakes Ecological Observatory Network. His mission is to bring together international collaboration of scientists and current climate research to open pathways to new ideas and tangible solutions. At a time when we are, this word gets me, undulated with disheartening weather and climate news, Dr. Brothers' focus is to shift the narrative away from the doomsday aspects of climate change and how far our societies here and around the world have already come in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change. Dr. Brothers comes to the ROM with an impressive international reputation and has worked in countries such as Germany, Japan, and across North America. The new position at the ROM, 4 years now, lured him back to Toronto to accept what he describes as his dream job. Dr. Brothers' research includes the effect of climate change on lakes and how changes in aquatic systems
influence their greenhouse gas emissions. He has a particular interest in a very special lake just west of Toronto called Crawford Lake. The lake has revealed details about our climate change, local climate, over the last 10,000 years. Let's welcome Dr. Brothers to tell us about this fascinating lake.
That's the guy that's going to talk, and that's you.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Okay.
Carolyn. Thank you, all of you. This is, can everyone hear me all right, first of all?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Alad, it's also nice to be, I mean, it's really exciting to learn more about this group, and it's great that it's the Leaside East York, because I'm also presenting from East York. I live around Main and Danforth, so I'm guessing some of us are probably not very far geographically, even though it feels that way sometimes on the internet. So I will just share my screen quickly, and let's see if we can get this going. Does this work for everyone? Can everyone see? Okay, looks good. So this is a version of a presentation, actually, and it's a sort of a longer version of a presentation that I gave with the museum's curator of plants, Deb Metzger, recently in November. And so we had co-curated this exhibition on Crawford Lake, and as Carol mentioned, this has been an area, and you're going to hear a lot more about Deb today too, and she plays a really key role in even bringing me into this project. But it felt like a perfect thing to speak about for tonight's event, because it definitely is fresh on my mind. And we already had a land acknowledgement, so I think we can, this is the ROM's land acknowledgement as well in terms of where we've been doing the work. And it has really been actually an important part of this process of working with Crawford Lake, as it's involved a lot of work with Wyandot community members, Anishinaabe community members, and Haudenosaunee. So that's been quite an interesting learning curve for me as well, in terms of getting into the contemporary politics in some ways of the Indigenous societies in Ontario, whose lands we inhabit. And I grew up here as well, by the way. I grew up in the Annex going to the ROM, so this is all very close to home for me. For those who are not familiar with Crawford Lake, here's a quick map where you can see on the bottom left. Can you see my cursor when I float around? Perfect. So we're in Toronto, obviously, and Crawford Lake is just about an hour's drive west. It's when you're driving west on the 401, if you're going up that part where you're kind of climbing the escarpment, if you get off right there in Campbellville, that's where you turn off for Crawford Lake. It's right perched on the top of the escarpment there. And it's nice. It looks like a footprint, kind of. It's a small lake. You can walk around it in half an hour. And most people, as with myself growing up in Toronto and Toronto area, mostly know it, I think, as a tourist site. It's the Crawford Lake Conservation Area. It's a nice place to go with a family. It's popular with Ontario school groups. So I remember going there as a kid. And when I saw this old picture, I was kind of looking to see, I mean, I'm of that era, so I was going there in the sort of mid 80s. And right now it has over 100,000 visitors per year. It is an educational site for Indigenous history and nature. So you can see in the background, it has reconstructed longhouses that were of the original, on some of the original sites, or very close to some of the original sites, where there had been archaeological work showing that there are longhouses there from late 1200s to around 1500. And then suddenly, boom, there was news in 2023. It was on the front page of the New York Times, on the BBC, and Globe and Mail, that this was what everyone was saying, the marker of the Anthropocene epoch. And I started at the ROM in 2021, and I just picked these three papers because they're big names. Obviously, this was really kind of a big global story on tons of news outlets around the world. And I had already been starting to work on Crawford Lake, so this didn't come as a complete surprise for me. But I did get a lot of questions that were saying, in the news, it said, this is the golden spike of the Anthropocene. And obviously, a bunch of people were saying, well, what's the Anthropocene? What does that mean? And what is the golden spike? Why is there a golden spike in the Anthropocene? And then the biggest one was, why Crawford Lake? What is this, this little local tourist site that we've been going to with our families? Why is this on the cover of the New York Times now? How is this a global news story, and how did it get to be that way? So that's kind of the story that I wanted to tell today with the talk. So I'm going to go pretty far back. and take a large step back. And I'm going to dig into some of the things that actually, in telling this story, we found even in the ROM Zone collection. So Deb and I dug in through the herbarium, and we found some old sheets. This was a picture of one of them, of a letter from September 1970 from a ROM curator, Jock McAndrews. John went as Jock, to the director of the Halton County Conservation Authority. And I won't read all of these letters in complete, but this one's kind of nice, and you can see the, the kind of typewriter font, and saying, "Dear Sir, as part of my research, I've been seeking a lake with laminated sediments." So that means that if you take a plug of sediments from the bottom of a lake, you'll see white lines that delineate each year. So such laminations appear to be deposited each year, and he wants to look through to see what the surrounding vegetation could be worked out in Ontario. So essentially, he wanted to reconstruct the history of trees in Ontario. He was a botanist. He was the curator of botany, and also, and you can see at this time, geology. So he had this kind of double role. And we have the response that they wrote to him, which is still in those, filing cabinets down there, saying that they're, very happy to have his letter and happy to help support him. And so this is where it really began. So this is 1970. And it's kind of funny that in that same binder, you have the next spring. There's, as far as we know, the first newspaper article about Crawford Lake research, which is in the Hamilton Spectator. Basically saying, there's a ROM curator who's doing something interesting at this lake, and they're going to find probably some cool things about the last 1,000 years of history in the sediments of this lake. And so here's a picture of Jock, and that's him pulling a sediment core, having a sediment core on the ice. What they would essentially do is take a hollow tube. When I talk about sediment core, what I'm referring to is a hollow tube, a metal tube that they'd fill with dry ice, and then they'd plunge it to the bottom of the lake. They'd do it usually in winter because it's easier to kind of keep things stable. You'd keep it there in the sediments, in the mud at the bottom of the lake for about 45 minutes for it to freeze onto that core. And then you'd pull it up and basically kind of carve off whatever froze to the outside of it. And so you can imagine at the top of it, you would have the bottom layer of mud, of today's lake. So if you go to the bottom of put your feet on the bottom of the lake, if you could do that, that would be the top of the core. And then as you go deeper in the core, you're going into history. You're going further back in time. And Jock hired one of his first master's student on this project is seen here. This is Maria Boyko. So she's sitting at the microscope. It was very difficult to find a photo of her. So we actually got this from her. She's now running a motel out in Alberta, but we did deep investigative work to reach out to her when we were putting this exhibition on. And she was the first person to be really kind of going through a lot of the sediments from Crawford Lake and starting to look into these questions. And we found some old footage too, that I'll share with you just very briefly. They had an old Super 8 video camera, and were able to capture some of these shots of just going to the lake back at those days and starting to visit the site. So this is Crawford Lake on a cold winter day. And there's the team climbing down. And I'm going to leave it with here, but this is these are some of the cores that they have. And there you can see those white lines with what referred to as laminations. And so you can see, and essentially what Jock wanted with this work is to be able to have, the reason he wanted these, quote, laminated sediments is that it was essentially a very easy way for Maria, working on it, to count back and know exactly what year she was looking at. There are other ways with kind of expensive analyses. You can try and figure out the date of a layer of mud. But most lakes, if you go to the bottom and you take a big plug of mud like that, it's just going to look like a big plug of mud. But this way, it was just kind of a faster way where she could count back and say, okay, this is, 100 years ago because there's 100 lines, and then this was 200 years ago, and so on. And I'm not going to be able to go through the whole history of 55 years or 50, getting to 56 years of research on the lake now. But very quickly, essentially, you can see on the left-hand side here, this is a new sediment core that's taken from the lake, but you can think about each of the sediment cores as being almost like a barcode. They all show the same thing. Every core that's taken from the lake has that same pattern. And something that Maria had noticed is you'll see at the bottom left, there's kind of a big white band. And that they noticed that that was on all of the cores they were taking from the lake, and they were curious to see what was happening there. So that was so actually, apparently on paper, Maria Boyko's project was really to look around the 1800s, what was happening with European settlement and how that impacted Ontario's forests. But she went down apparently on her own, out of her own curiosity, took some sediments from those deep white layers, and she found this big pollen grain. And so that was how she was reconstructing forests, was looking through pollen. And you can see pollen from pine is distinct from pollen from elm and so on. And according to the story, according to some people who were there, she went with this pollen grain to Jock, to her supervisor, and said, do you know what this is? And he said, no, but we have a herbarium and we have slides here and you can figure that out. So she went through and figured out that it was a species of grass. It was much larger, apparently, than any tree pollen grains. And that species was Zea maize, which is corn, which is not native to Ontario. So she apparently came back to Jock and said, I think this indicates that there must have been Indigenous farming around here, because there's corn that people must have brought here in quite high concentrations at this layer. And that layer dates to about, you're looking at about 1280 or the 1300s at that point. And apparently Jock was of the attitude in time that he said, well, don't you think someone else would have figured that out before you if it was that big a deal? But it was, and she did come through, and it did end up being, because of that discovery, they started reaching out to local people, realized that there was a lot of Indigenous artifacts where people were farming around there, and it opened up a whole world of archaeological work, which is what led to the reconstruction of the longhouses. So it really started with Maria Boyko's work in the lake that led to our understanding of the human history. And through that work, both the work in the sediment cores and also then through the archaeological work, they both agree on there being really kind of intensive periods of farming from around 1280 to around 1500. And so later, this became already then a really important site of interest for local Ontarians, especially. And so there's another slightly more recent picture of Jock showing a group of people kind of walking them through the core. And on the top right, or on the right-hand side here, that's a picture of Jock loading one of these cores with dry ice. And on the left is Deb Metzger, the curator of plants who got me involved with Crawford Lake. So she reached out to me, I think on my second week on the job as curator of climate change, saying, have you heard of Crawford Lake, and do you want to work with this and join us with this? And so she's still very active, and she and I have been co-curating a lot of the work around the museum, and she's really introduced me to this whole story. And she started at the RUM, I think it was 1984. This was just when she had begun working there, and she was enticed to the RUM because of Jock McAndrews, and she had seen him speak, I think, at Queen's University before that about Crawford Lake, and she just thought it was such a cool, interesting story. So it's really nice to see how things have come really full circle. And this was a picture from RUM magazine at the time in the 80s. So what the core tells us now, we have 55 years of history, 55 years of research, I should say, into its history. And I put together just sort of a quick highlight of, what people have seen since then. So we have that story of it's now attributed to Attawandaron or pre-Wendat peoples who had been farming there from the 1280s to about 1500. And it's really interesting, actually. What they've even pieced together is that you can kind of see in the core in that section there's these little black spots. They look kind of like moons on Jupiter to me. But those are pieces of goose poop. And what happened was that the farming that people had cleared the land there, they cleared out the trees, they had crops of corn and beans and squash and sunflowers that attracted Canada geese to the area. Apparently around that time, it's believed that Canada geese were not actually They would have just been migrating through southern Ontario and not really spending full years here. But it seems that they spent a lot of time around Crawford Lake. So we have lots of goose poop in there, and we can see scientists at the ROM looked into their goose poop and could see that they had the pollen, and they were the ones bringing the pollen from the fields to the lake. So it's because of them that we have that record, and we were able to make that human connection. All that goose poop in the lake added nutrients to the lake, which promoted a lot of algal growth. So it became this probably very kind of green algae-filled lake, which elevated the pH. So it became less acidic, more basic as a lake. And what that did is it created a chemical reaction where you had calcite. So the calcium carbonate kind of coming out, precipitating out of the water column like snow. And every summer it would do that. And that's the white layer. That's the lamination that creates the record of the annual history that we still follow today. And you can see that big white band, it's really kind of intensive white layering. Below that, before the human farming from the 1200s, there's no annual record like that. So that farming in the 1200s is what kicked off this process that we still have in the lake today. But it wasn't just humans changed the environment, it's humans changed the behavior of the birds, which changed the algae, which changed the chemistry of the lake, which left this whole record for us, almost like a book that we could read through today. And then around 1500, we have the start of a period called Little Ice Age. So the Northern Hemisphere's temperature cooled globally, but across the Northern Hemisphere by about 0.8 degrees Celsius. It seems that Crawford Lake, that area, was right on the verge of where agriculture was possible, where it was warm enough for agriculture to occur, to sustain those kinds of villages based on beans and corn. So you don't have any after 1500. You have a lot more pine trees, kind of plant species that become a lot more cold tolerant. There's kind of an interesting note that there's a spike in this is birch pollen at one point, which is an indicator that there was a forest fire that went through there in the early 1700s. And then you can kind of see it in this picture. There's a color shift in the lake, where it's sort of reddish sediments below it and it's sort of darker sediments above. And that year, when that color shift occurs, is 1874, which is the year that the Crawford family built a sawmill right next to the lake. And so the Crawford family had moved from England. It was actually two brothers who married two sisters. They have a whole really interesting story. I met them recently at the opening of this exhibition, many of the great-grandchildren. But their impact is very evident in the lake in terms of the way that they were building the sawmill around it. You have deforestation, you have a change in the forest community again, and it goes beyond them with also the Southern Ontario, widespread deforestation, and you have a lot more grasses and those kinds of pollens coming in. We have the largest, brightest white line in the sediment core in the last 1,000 years is 1935, associated with the North American Dust Bowl event. So you have a lot of nutrients and things coming in with that. So it's kind of continental scale. We have these black things, these little black spheres. They're called fly ash. And those are a byproduct of burning fossil fuels. And those start increasing in the 40s and then really kind of spiking in the 50s and 60s. And it's this kind of acceleration of industrial activity, both locally, if you think of Hamilton, and then also really kind of across the continent and globally. That's increasing then in the mid-20th century. Some scientists have measured plutonium in each of those sediment layers, and you can see plutonium increasing in the 1940s. There's actually a measure of plutonium in 1945 because, with the very first nuclear bomb, which is this pictures of the Trinity test in New Mexico. And the winds were blowing from New Mexico to Ontario that day in 1945. So we have a plutonium from the first ever nuclear weapon explosion. But also there's a global signal of plutonium increasing. It's in Crawford Lake, but it's everywhere on the planet, with nuclear weapons testing around the world, especially in the Pacific. And then that signal drops dramatically in 1963 when you have the Test Ban Treaty. So you can see that global pattern. You can kind of see in this picture that there's an area of dark around there, and that's with the acid precipitation. And so you get the varves, those white laminated layers getting much fainter. And that's because the lake was a bit too acidic to have that precipitation of calcite that really started this process off during that time. And then you can see that things bounded back. There was the Clean Air Act, and and some of the processes change in terms of how we having scrubbers on smokestacks and things like that as well. You can see indications from the construction of local visitor center. There's impacts from the archaeological work. And then more recently, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just a few highlights. With climate warming, there's been a change in algae. This picture is called Asterionella formosa. It's a kind of diatom that people associate with warming, and which is increasing in the lake now. And I have this word teleconnections there. That just indicates signals from global changes in even natural climate shifts. So El Nino years, La Ninas, patterns in Pacific and Atlantic, cool and warm periods that go over decades or multiple decades. Those are kind of mapped throughout the core and including in recent years. So you can see how the lake is not just a signal of what's local change, but also global change. So it's a really neat storyteller that has this indigenous history, it has the colonial history. It's equally global and local in terms of that story. And just really quickly, one of my favorite ones that didn't make it into that, but this is a local plant that, I don't know if any of you have gardens, you've probably seen this and probably pulled it out a million times and keep on pulling it out. This is common purslane, and it's a common weed in Ontario. And this was something that we weren't quite sure with what to do. So in Jock McAndrews and their colleagues' early papers, this was one of the plants that was growing in that early Indigenous period. So in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, there's lots of purslane pollen. And I looked it up. I wasn't sure if this was a crop or a weed. If you look up on the internet, it's considered by the World Health Organization one of the most important herbs globally. It's one of the only plants, or maybe the only plant that naturally produces omega-3 fatty acids. So it's a very popular food source in some cultures. The interesting thing was that when we looked at that, most of the cultures that it seemed to be important for were Mediterranean. It's a common thing in salads in Greece, for instance. And so we weren't really sure how to put it in. And it is also something that just pops up when when you're gardening and you have a spot of clear land. I noticed at one point, after we had even almost gotten close to finishing the exhibition, that it was identified somewhere as being a weed or a introduced species. It was non-native in Ontario, and I thought that was weird. Like, why would it be introduced? I know it was here being farmed in 1300s. So I looked up just to start on Wikipedia, and it said, common purslane originated in the Mediterranean region. It's from North Africa and, Greece and that area. But there is one record of a lake in North America and Canada that has that's shown that common purslane was here before Columbus. And I clicked on the link for that, and it was a paper in Nature magazine by Jock McAndrews talking about Crawford Lake and this record of it there. So this is as far as I know, still, it was from 1974, that paper. It's the only record of this species having existed in North America prior to Columbus. And so in that paper, they even proposed that it was perhaps the Vikings that brought it here. So they were assuming it was also a European species. Anyway, all of that to say, I mean, there's lots of really interesting little tendrils of stories and little goose hole, little rabbit holes you can go down with Crawford Lake in terms of the evidence that's there and the research that's been done. Oh, and I probably should have, pushed this forward first. But yeah, this is where you can see there's a big peak around 1440. And in this paper, Jock McAndrews also noted that it has very heavy pollens. They think that there was so much in the lake because they were maybe washing it. So he was assuming that the indigenous peoples living there used it as a food source. But we don't know yet. We haven't been able to find anything definitive on that. So I've come now to give that history, and I wanted to come back to that question that I asked at the beginning in terms of what is the Anthropocene and really where did this end up on that world stage? So for those who are not familiar with the term, the Anthropocene is almost a hypothetical consideration of a new epoch being defined by human impacts on the planet. You can almost think of it as a science fiction idea of, would a geologist in a million years, looking back through these layers of time, pinpoint 1952 or, this period that we're in broadly as a new, distinct geological time frame, new epoch for the whole planet that would be defined by how we are changing planetary systems. So it's really kind of thinking forward to say what's the evidence that's going to be left behind, and what would a geologist of the future see? Um, and the way that geologists work, just as a field, is that if they have a date for any distinction between a geological period in history, if it's the Paleocene becoming the Eocene, if that change in time period has been identified with a specific date, they'll have what's called a global boundary stratotype section and point, and the short term of that is a golden spike. And so that's a place where in the world there will be for instance, a hillside in China or in Italy where there will be a brass spike in that hillside that says this is the golden spike for that layer change from Paleocene below and the Eocene above, the best place to show that change. So with the Anthropocene, there was an Anthropocene working group that was formed over 10 years ago that was tasked with basically putting together a proposal. What's the evidence for us having changed the planet in a way that's really going to be geologically significant? And part of that proposal is, where would the golden spike be? Where is the best place that if this goes forward, we would put that brass spike? And there was a short list of about 12 places around the world, and it was some of them were lakes, some of them were coral reefs, some were caves, stalactites. There was an Antarctic ice core, but as you can see here, number 7 in this list was Crawford Lake, and that was the one out of these 12 shortlisted global sites that was voted by that committee as being the best place to really represent how the planet has changed at the hands of people. So what makes Crawford Lake so special? There's no, I don't have an insight into what people were thinking when they voted in that Anthropocene working group, but working on this exhibition at the museum, I felt like for me, it likely came down to 3 things. One is that we have this really interesting geology at the site. Second is the research history, and the third is the human history. And I'll dive into a little bit more with each of these. So the geological setting, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's right on the top of the Niagara Escarpment. You have a lot of these really interesting kind of timekeepers there. This on the top right, if anyone goes to the exhibition at the ROM, they'll see this log as they enter it. And this was, we have, this is a stump from one of the world's most ancient forests. It's a white cedar, an eastern cedar, that lived from 650 to 1850 AD and growing on the cliff face of the Niagara Escarpment. So you have this really interesting kind of biology and geology at this site, and that landscape that is limestone, which is very rich in calcium, which is what creates also that calcium carbonate, which I mentioned creates those varves. Here you can see a cross section, and first thing you'll notice is that Crawford Lake is not a huge lake, but it's very deep, and limestone is a really great material for making caves. It's very, it can become porous very quickly as water dissolves it. And it's believed that there used to be a cave below Crawford Lake that caved in at some point. And so you essentially have this very deep hole, which never mixes all the way to the bottom. And here we have an example of some limestone where you can kind of see the effect that water has on it over time. And if you were to go, and as scientists have, and take measurements at different depths in Crawford Lake, you can see, for instance, here's conductivity being extremely high at the bottom, and dissolved oxygen drops somewhat. But this is an indicator of what's called meromixis, the same at the top here, which just speaks to it never mixing all the way. And that's what's really responsible for the fact that you get this really great preservation environment where whatever settles down to the bottom is not going to be mixed back up with the next storm. And that's where you get these really beautiful annual white layers. And here you can see that's both that indigenous interval where the farming began in the 1280s, and then you can see some of those goose poops there too. And then the second thing, so you have a place where things are really recorded well. The second thing is you need someone who's going to read those records. And there's Jock McAndrews and Deb again. There's too many people to name here. This is Charlie Turton. He volunteered with Jock for decades, and he was the one that really went through the goose poops and identified what they were eating and how they linked that to the lake. the other person who was really key for me getting involved with this was Francine McCarthy. She and Deb were both master's students with Jock McAndrews at the same time in the 80s, and she went on to be a professor at Brock University, and she's been the main champion for Crawford Lake at the global stage now. So she's the member of the Anthropocene Working Group who represented it, who brought it forward. And she's been speaking. She gave a talk recently at the Vatican to the papal science circles about the Anthropocene in Crawford Lake. So she's the really kind of the world's voice on Crawford Lake and the foremost expert. And then, of course, you have new generations all the time. So this is a team of people that were working there in early April 2024 when I was out helping out with some field work. And there's a lot of young students who are still carrying out work. And then you have a place where things are being recorded. You have people telling that record. And then, of course, you need an interesting story to give it that kind of grit. And there is this really interesting human history at the lake. I mentioned the indigenous farming of maize. We have, this is an old family photo from the Crawford family having a little picnic campfire by the side of the lake. And you have this global history. This is a picture of trinitite, which we have in the exhibition. It's a glass created by that very first nuclear explosion in New Mexico. And so you have this global story, this local colonial story, and this local indigenous story that all kind of meld together. And I can imagine that there's lakes and places that will have maybe one or two of these. There's other lakes that don't mix, but maybe people haven't been studying them so intensely for 55 years. Or you might have a place that there was a really interesting thing happening, but that record was not well preserved just because of the setting of a place. And it's been the most interesting to see where these things have come together and kind of melded into both the human history and the sort of biological natural history. And I don't know if anyone would recognize this site. It's about, if we were in the same room, I would probably make you all feel awkward right now and ask someone to speak out. But I'm going to give it away pretty quickly. This is a photo I got from the Toronto Archives. This is Queen's Park, looking north from Queen's Park. So this is where the ROM is. Now it would be just behind those trees on the left-hand side, looking towards Bloor Street. And those were all elm trees. And as was common in many cities across North America at the time, elm was a really resilient tree species that people loved planting in cities, apparently because it didn't mind about pollution, and you could be kind of rough with it, and it would just kind of establish itself quite well. And one of the rabbit holes I went down with this exhibition too was spending a day at the Toronto Archives looking through everything they had on Dutch elm disease. I'm lucky that my neighbor actually in East York is one of the archivists there, so she invited me and helped me kind of going through what they have at the Toronto Archives. And you'd find again these amazing letters. Here's one to the city from it's from the 1960s, 1963. Your Worship, a beautiful elm tree in my neighbor's lawn died this past summer from the Dutch elm disease. I have a very fine elm tree on my property, and I fear that it may now be infected with the same disease. I'm leaving no stone unturned in my efforts to find a treatment to save this tree. There's reams of these letters in the Toronto Archives from people concerned and looking for solutions with Dutch elm disease. And Dutch elm disease is one of the signals in Crawford Lake, actually. There's a decline in elm tree pollen in the 50s and 60s associated with Dutch elm disease. And it was one of the factors that Francine McCarthy had suggested could be considered a biological indicator of the Anthropocene, given that it's a signal of this sort of globalization. You have new sort of pathogens and fungi and things going all around the world as you have this acceleration of human activities. And what Dutch elm disease is actually kind of interesting in itself. It's a fungus, but the fungus is spread by a beetle. And here you can see we have both of these in the exhibition as well. And the great thing about working at the ROM is you can just reach out to the mycologist and she'll give you an example of Dutch elm disease from those collections. And we reach out to the entomologist and he's like, of course, or she, in our case, was, of course, here's an elm bark beetle. So we could put this story together. with our collections. But you see these little kind of radiating lines, and those are called galleries. And essentially, elm bark beetles they dig these little galleries, and the fungus spreads through the galleries, and that's how the disease spreads, and it kills elm trees. It's originally a Eurasian one. It's called Dutch elm disease just because it's believed that the shipment, or the last place that it had left Eurasia for North America, was the Netherlands, but it didn't originate there. And essentially, our elm trees here do not have the same defenses to it that other elm trees have in Eurasia. One of the interesting things I also found out since this exhibition opened is that these elm bark beetles, or these bark beetles on the right, they go back, there's research on them going back over 150 million years to the time of the dinosaurs as being associated with some of the earliest amber kind of sort of attacks on trees, and trees producing lots of amber to ward off certain beetles. And they were creating these galleries back then. And something that's unique about them is that they are farmers as well. So this type of beetle has compartments in its head that are designed to hold these fungi at a certain temperature and humidity. And they're farmers, they bring them to different trees and they farm it and they eat it. So they're actually cultivating the fungi. They're creating these galleries almost as crops, as lines in a field. And then they're eating them. So it's this kind of interesting realization that there is actually records of two farmers destroying trees, or two species of farmers at Crawford Lake, both humans and beetles, practicing different forms of agriculture over the last millennium. So if you're to speak to Francine McCarthy and people from the Anthropocene Working Group, the real evidence that they're focused in of this whole story is the plutonium. So that's been proposed by geologists as probably the best, not a really meaningful, I would say, a piece of evidence in itself in terms of ecology of the lake. I don't think there's anything that you could trace the lake ecosystem that would have been aware that there was this trace amount of plutonium there. But the fact that it's a global human signal that will be in any sediment on the planet is where they felt that this is the geological evidence. And it's really kind of a marker or a proxy for all of these other things that are happening that are significant. And you think about the extinctions and the species invasions and other stuff happening around the world. But it did leave us kind of with this question, is this really what the most interesting thing? And I'm guessing probably from hearing me speak now for over half an hour, you probably would agree that this is maybe not the most exciting story that the Corps has to offer. I mean, in some ways, it's the one that's the least unique to this lake. It's the one, what makes it the marker of the Anthropocene is that every place has this, not only Crawford Lake. When people talk about the Great Acceleration, and I'm not going to spend too much time with this, and I'm sorry to give you kind of 24 graphs in one, and I don't expect you to read through all of them, but this is often referred to as the 24 graphs of the Great Acceleration. So this is, basically this period in the 1950s of accelerating human populations. And with that, you have an acceleration in economy and energy usage and water use and all of these different factors. And then on the right-hand side, scientists have linked that to all of these changes in the planet in response to that, but thinking of greenhouse gases, thinking about ozone, thinking about acidification of the oceans. So it's really kind of looking again at that 50s as a period where, yes, a geologist looking in the future will probably see that something happened around that time, and it's associated with this upscaling of our systems. But it was really important to me that we didn't leave the story at that. And so I've really focused on three takeaways, and I know I'm kind of getting close to the end of the time here, so I'm going to have to rush a little bit. I'll probably skip a slide or two. But the three main takeaways that we really wanted to leave people with was that, one, the impact didn't just scale to population. The story that Crawford Lake told me and Deb as well is that, you have populations of these villages, Attawandaron and Pre-Wendat, in the 1300s, through especially the 1300s and 1400s. They were probably about 300 people at any given time based on the archaeological work. And you also would have had people living before and after that, maybe with less obvious impacts due to lifestyles. For instance, Anishinaabe may have started the forest fire. There's a lot of forest fire and wildfire tree clearing that occurred historically on this land, especially to make habitat for animals that people wanted to hunt, and also regenerative for the ecosystem itself. Then you have one family moving there, Crawford family. They were probably about a dozen people, and you can see their impact being quite small and or quite large in terms of that color shift and the deforestation and the impact of the mill. And then now we have, archaeological work, and then since then over 100,000 visitors a year. And I think, when we talk about global population, and it's important to recognize that population is a factor, definitely, in what's happening at the global scale. But choice is such a big part of this too, and what people are doing. And that's a function, the impact on the environment when we think about that is really a function of behavior and population. It's not simply population. And I think it's interesting seeing here, just to kind of illustrate that, as you can see that this is it's called a rotifer. It's a little picture of one on the top right. These are things that eat algae. And you can see they have a big spike of them with the indigenous farming in the 1400s with a few hundred people there. And you have a big spike of them, right after the Crawford family built the sawmill. And it's not as if it's a direct response against the number of people. This is 12 people creating a spike that hundreds of people living there had a few centuries earlier. I would also say that there's never no impact. We sometimes hear people talking about leaving no footprint on the land. And I think it's interesting and maybe valuable to kind of reframe some of the way we think about that, and instead saying, well, we are naturally and intricately intertwined. Everything that we do as people, we will always be getting food from somewhere. We're always going to be moving around, and things will be stuck to the bottom of our shoes, or bringing crops with us from Mexico to Ontario. We are, part of this kind of natural flow of shifts in ecosystems. And here, this is the changes in tree populations. This is pines, oaks, elms, birch, and I'm forgetting now what I guess it's beech, and maple. And so you have these different kinds of trees that are, there's ebbs and flows that have human signals. They also have these natural climatic signals. There's going to be now signals associated with contemporary climate change, but there's never no impact. And I think that maybe, instead of trying to think about, how can we live with no impact on the environment, I think it's maybe better to think about how do we, what are our impacts? How do we embrace those impacts and switch them from being kind of bad impacts or negative impacts where we're destroying an ecosystem, or making it harder for certain organisms to thrive, to making them positive impacts? And how can we interact with the ecosystem in a way that maybe creates more habitat or creates more opportunities for biodiversity and protects certain organisms from other environmental threats that are coming in? So this is a better way, and I think, to kind of recognize that we have an impact, but it doesn't have to be a negative one. And then the third part there is that this is not a trajectory just from good to bad. Sediment records show this period that periods of human-caused natural disturbances, and it's more of a flow of kind of going back and forth between these. And you can see, and I've told people, if we were to take a sediment core from the lake in the 1950s, it would be much scarier than the story it tells you today from Crawford Lake. In terms of, you'd have this peak in fly ash associated with that time. You would have a peak in plutonium with all the nuclear weapons testing. You would see the barbs would have disappeared because there's all that acid rain. And taking sediment cores today, you'd be able to look back and say, well, these are actually some issues that we were able to resolve. We actually put scrubbers in, and our air quality got better locally at the local scale. We had the nuclear weapons test ban treaty, so we stopped that plutonium effect. We improved our air quality for the acid rain. Not to say that any of these things are permanent, not to say that any of this outweighs the threat of the global climate crisis today, but just to say that, we actually have a history. The story that this lake tells us is of a history of humans responding to environmental changes and solving some of them and coming back. And it's not as if this is a one-off thing. And I'm just going to kind of skim through just to say, I wanted to mention that, the work that we've done, this is Deb Metzger at a recent kind of ROM members evening. we've done a lot of stuff to bring these messages forward to the public through the ROM. We've also acquired sediments. We have the exhibition. We have ongoing research. I'm just gonna kind of skim through these just to show some of the stuff that we've been doing. Here's the exhibition space. It's going to be up there until September if anyone is interested to see it. And it already has over 100,000 visitors. So it's been really exciting to see how many people have come. And that's just since September 27th is when it opened last year. So it's been really popular. And it's a really great opportunity to celebrate this research and especially the role of so many women throughout it, starting with Maria Boyko and really that discovery of the corn pollen and up to Francine McCarthy now and Deb Metzger, who have really carried that baton. And it's forward looking. We're still opening up new research. I'm working with the mineralogy team at the museum. We've had interns looking at some of the new questions. And we might be linking it now with some of the tree records that are there to look at a more refined link between what the trees record and what the lake recorded right around the corner. And then going further back in this terms of changing course, we also have a replica of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt in the exhibition space, which was made by Ken Miracle, who's a Mohawk artist, lives on Manitoulin Island. And it's a really nice reminder too. This is some people may have heard that we live on treaty lands of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. This was a representation of the peace treaty, the Great Peace of Montreal from 1701 between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people nations at the end of what's called the Beaver Wars. So this was a period going through the 1600s. Again, this is in the Little Ice Age, where there was a lot of heavy exploitation on the landscape and on the ecosystems there. In Southern Ontario and across the region. And essentially, you can see that on the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt, it's kind of a blue circle with the white sort of line in the middle. Depending who you ask, that white line either represents a spoon or a beaver tail, and the blue circle represents a bowl or a dish. And the idea is to think about the landscape and the lands where we're in the waters where we're living as a shared resource, as something that you're sharing, you're passing around that spoon, and you're making sure that you keep it clean, you're making sure you leave enough food for everyone else. And you essentially, it boils down to that you're not exploiting that resource. And it's interesting to, again, I like to remind people that if this was introduced as a law in 1701, it's coming out of a time that people felt they were not living well with the land and that they had to introduce this as a reminder at that time to live better than they were. So again, there's a really nice reminder of local history and the people who've been living here since then, of these kinds of ebbs and flows of how we interact with the landscape. And I want to make sure that you all have time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to skip through it and leave it with a photo of also the exhibition leader, Monique on the right, Monique McFarlane, and Deb and myself on the left there. And thank you again so much. And apologies for going a little bit over and I always talk a little bit more than I know that I said with these things. You can tell I can talk for hours about this. So.
Well, it was very interesting, Soren. We have 10 minutes for questions. So if everybody could just ask one question, make it brief. And then at 5:02, I will be coming back with the gentle cutoff of questions. So go ahead, Soren, if you could just raise your hand. Jane, should we just let people just raise their hand and Soren?
Sure. Well, I think Sid, you had your physical hand up, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with the core that you're putting down into the lake, especially when I look at that picture you had of how deep the lake was. So then that made me think, how long was this core thing that you must have put into the lake? It must have been extremely long to get to the bottom of the lake.
Well, they attach it to a rope. So and it's weighted. So yeah, you have the core itself is, well, yeah, it's probably the ones that I was helping them with a couple of years ago were about maybe 10 feet long, but it's on the top of a rope so that they hold
that makes
put
sense.
that down. And then it's a bit of an art of making sure it doesn't.
Huge, massive thing.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Louise, you had your hand up there.
Follow up to the same question about the core. once you hit the bottom, how deep do you go to get 1,000 years worth of information?
Yeah, so that core that you saw there, that I showed the picture with that long history, that's again about 1,000 years. That would be about maybe 3 feet of sediment,
Really?
3 or 4 feet.
Really compacted.
Yeah,
Ooh.
but you could go down further. So I spoke to there's actually an Anishinaabe scientist at Queen's who's working on some of the deeper sediments. So she's working on like the 7,000-year-old sediments right now and looking at that story. So it goes, the sediment goes as far as the lake's probably been around for about 10,000 years since glaciation. And so I don't know. I'd be curious to ask her how far down she had to go for those cores. And you'd have to use a different technique, but you'd have these kind of things where you get more pressure and piston coring, things like that. Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Maddie?
Any idea where that corn came from? If it was so long ago, and I don't think it's from Europe, but is there any research on where that initial corn came from?
Well, corn
It was not native, you said, right?
Well, it was domesticated in Mexico.
Oh,
So
it
it would have
came
been
from
brought.
Mexico.
Yeah, and same with the sunflowers that they had as crops. That would have come as a crop that was a Mesoamerican crop that they transported up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the Mississippi or something.
Yeah, and there's cultures. I think this is around the time of there's like a kind of a mega city called Cahokia, I think, around where St. Louis is now, and that's believed to have had large sort of trading networks that reached into southern Ontario. So I don't know if this would have been associated with that. That would be a question for an archaeologist or yeah, someone other than a lake scientist like me. But definitely that was kind of an indicator that, and it is accepted that I think corn was domesticated in Mexico, in modern day Mexico.
Thank you.
Yeah. There was another hand, Barbara.
I visited Crawford Lake in the mid 80s, and it was probably around the time when it was being talked about in the papers for the first time. And I remember just being amazed at the color of the lake. It's this beautiful turquoise, as I recall.
It could be, and that could also. It's not always that color, but you may have been there during it. There's what's called whiting events, which is when it could be during a period that was really warm and there was a lot of algae, and that would create that calcium precipitation. So we get that, for instance, with Lake Ontario, where you can get this really bright turquoise. I've never seen Crawford Lake like that, but that wouldn't surprise me that could have happened, especially around the time that they were doing that archaeological work, and there was a lot of probably sediments flowing in every time they had a rainfall, and that could produce that sort of a response. Yeah, that's interesting to hear. That's interesting for me to hear that you saw.
It was beautiful, the lake itself.
Interesting. Martha? Oh, you're muted. You're still muted. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, you're good.
I have this earring. It's so beautiful. I don't know if I can show it well, but it was actually made from a core sample. It's brilliant. Oh, it's got a beautiful stripe across it, but you can't see. It's got the lines. And I just love the idea that this had a whole bunch of Canada in it.
Amazing.
And they were my favorite earrings for years, and I lost one. So at least now I have a use I can show people.
But that's like from Crawford Lake core sample?
I don't know. I know it was from Ontario somewhere.
Interesting.
But it's just
very nice.
I'm trying to show the pattern, but it's got, the lines on it. It's just so beautiful.
Very cool.
But I was wondering about that picture you showed when you were talking about the golden spike with all that human interaction, all those scoops that people must have done.
I'm not sure. Do you mean the
golden spike? And you were talking about where it was going to be put, and it's going to land in Crawford Lake. But you had a map with several different possible sites, and you had a photograph up of it. Looked like a seaside or Oh,
Let's see.
picture.
The Anthropocene.
Slide.
I know the slide that you mean.
And I just wondered where that was and what had we been doing.
On a sec. So let me just share my screen again to make sure that I'm looking at the right. So, is this the picture? Oh, this is the slide.
It was a photograph. Oh, it was
Are you thinking of this one?
no, it's before. It's the one before.
Oh, this
Yeah,
one.
that
This one. Yeah, actually, I should have probably said. So this was actually a picture from a film called The Anthropocene, which is by Edward Bertinsky and Jennifer Bikewell and yeah, Mercury Films. So they have a really interesting ROM connection and donated some. We have footage of Francine being coring at Crawford Lake that they produced, the same people who produced this film. But this is a picture of, I think it's the largest excavators on the planet in Germany, mining for coal. So each of those kind of towers is an excavator that has a person in it. And you can kind of see on the top right, there's forest there with trees just look like little like hair. So it's just the scale of some of the change. And this is, I felt like it was an iconic picture to speak to the scale of human impacts on the planet and the geological impact that we have.
Yeah, he did a fabulous movie called Industrial Landscapes, I think it was.
Manufactured landscapes. Yeah.
But yeah, that made me think of what our little Crawford Lake could look like if we don't take care of it.
Yes. Hopefully. Well, I mean, it's interesting right now. There's a moratorium even on coring, on any coring on it, given the indigenous respective personhood for the lake. So I think that was actually part of the story with its being selected as the Golden Spike, in that it's a place where people could hypothetically do more research, but it's also protected. And people are not going to just be able to go there. And definitely Crawford Lake Conservation Area will defer to their Indigenous Council, which is about 15 members, before any more work would be done on it.
That's good news.
Absolutely.
We have time for one more question. I think Sheila just put up her hand.
Yep.
I'm curious about, now maybe this won't affect it that much, like, are there limits on water activities and the numbers of visitors? And it reminds me of, I don't know if you know of Pink Lake in the Gatineau, where you aren't allowed to even go into it because, I'm just curious to know about restrictions.
I don't think there's any restrictions on the numbers of people that can go there. I mean, I think they're happy to have more tourists, but you can't go into it. So they don't have people swimming in it, or I mean, even for when we did take the last cores from it in April 2024, they were not allowed to put. So normally they would do it in the winter, and that was not an issue. But there was no ice that winter; it was so warm, so they had to go out with boats. But you're not allowed to lay anchor in it because they don't want the bottom to be totally disturbed by a bunch of anchors, scientists going there. So they actually had to take ropes. They had to build a platform which they attached by ropes to the shorelines. They had to spend a day just kind of creating these platforms that didn't disturb the sediments of the lake, and then they could take boats out there. But they couldn't take boats that had gas engines. They didn't want that gasoline going into the lake. So they are very cautious about the lake's water quality and making sure that anything people take there, they're not going to be introducing new species or pollution or anything like that.
Well, Soren, we could stay here all night, and I could have listened to you for another 2 hours. I found it fascinating just looking at that core sediment. I could have had a lecture just on that, and being so impressed, I was going to ask the same question as Louise. How deep was that core sample? And it blows me away that it was like 3 feet. And the changes in history, just the impacts of the ecosystems. And I never really knew about Crawford Lake, about the studying and the golden spike. And then you blew me away again with that graphs of the great acceleration. In the
Oh, yeah.
1950s, I had no idea of all the negative impacts just in that period. You know, you think 70 years later, you can see the graphs moving up, you know, taller on the right.
Mhm.
But just you packed so much in there, I'm not going to be able to fall asleep, you know. But great for my brain. And thank you on behalf of all the club members and people that will be able to see the recording on our website.
Thank
So
you so
thank you.
much.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
it was my joy.
Soren.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you do all get to sleep well and stay warm tonight.
Terrific. So good night, and Jane is closing the meeting. No,
Actually, no, I am.
excuse me. I meant to say Sid.
It's
I'm so
okay.
used to
It's a,
Jane.
anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Brothers, and thank you all for coming out on the, no, you didn't come out. You stayed home and were with us tonight. Thank you so very much. And our next meeting will be February 19th by Zoom. So stay warm, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you. Bye.
Bye. Good night. Bye, Soren.
Bye.
Happy New Year, everyone.